At exactly 10:14 p.m., inside a $12 million estate just outside Greenwich, Connecticut, a security camera recorded something no one had planned for and no one could explain. A housemaid, hired just weeks earlier, stood alone in a dimly lit room, moving slowly, deliberately, in front of a man the world had already written off. His name was Robert Whitmore, a former hedge fund titan who, after a catastrophic stroke, had not spoken, moved, or responded in nearly 2 years. The best neurologists in the country had examined him. The verdict had been the same every time: severe, irreversible brain damage. His son, Daniel Whitmore, had spent over $800,000 on treatments, specialists, experimental therapies, and private care. Nothing had worked. Machines kept his father alive, but whatever made him who he was seemed gone. By the time that footage was recorded, Daniel had stopped asking if his father would recover. The question had shifted to how long this quiet, suspended existence would continue. And yet, in that moment, something about what the maid was doing didn't fit. It wasn't random. It wasn't careless. It looked intentional, because as she moved, slowly and rhythmically, something changed. It was subtle, so subtle that anyone else might have missed it. But the camera didn't. And when Daniel Whitmore saw it later that night, he replayed the footage 3 times, then 5, then 10. Because what happened next didn't align with any medical report he had ever read. It didn't match the conclusions of world-class specialists. And it certainly didn't match what he believed was possible. Because for the first time in 2 years, his father responded. Who was this woman? And why was she risking everything for a man she barely knew? Her name was Elena Ruiz, a quiet presence in a house built on precision and control, someone most people passed without a second glance. She had been hired to clean, to stay invisible, to follow instructions, and keep her distance. Yet here she was, standing in front of Robert Whitmore, doing something no one had authorized, no one had suggested, and certainly no one believed would matter. How did she understand something the world's most respected neurologists couldn't? Over the past 2 years, Robert Whitmore had been examined by specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and private consultants flown in at extraordinary cost. Each one reviewed scans, monitored brain activity, and delivered the same conclusion with careful certainty. There was no meaningful response, no awareness that could be reliably measured, no indication that recovery, in any functional sense, was likely. And yet Elena had seen something different. Not in a report, not in a chart, but in the smallest, almost invisible details most people ignored. A shift in breathing, a flicker in the eyes, a pause that didn't feel random. While others saw a body sustained by machines, she watched with a kind of patience that didn't come from training alone, but from years of observing, learning, and quietly teaching herself what no one had formally given her the chance to study. And why did Daniel Whitmore, a man who trusted only evidence, data, and proven outcomes, come within minutes of firing her that same night? Because just before that moment in the room, Elena had already crossed a line. One that, in Daniel's world, wasn't just inappropriate, it was unacceptable. She had stepped outside her role, questioned boundaries, and acted on something he didn't understand. And in a house where everything was controlled down to the smallest detail, that kind of decision had consequences. Richard Whitmore wasn't a man who believed in luck. Every dollar he earned, every decision he made, every risk he took was calculated down to the smallest variable. He built his fortune in private equity, turning failing companies into profit machines with a reputation for discipline and control. People who worked with him described him the same way: focused, efficient, and emotionally distant. In Richard's world, outcomes were measured, not hoped for. If something couldn't be proven, tested, or repeated, it didn't belong in the conversation. That same mindset followed him into his personal life. When his father, Robert Whitmore, suffered a catastrophic stroke at the age of 68, Richard approached the situation the only way he knew how. He assembled a team of specialists, reviewed every scan, analyzed every report, and authorized treatments without hesitation. He didn't ask what it would cost. He asked what would work. And when the answers stopped changing, when every expert reached the same conclusion, Richard adjusted his expectations the way he would in business. He accepted the data, even if he couldn't accept the loss behind it. Because Robert Whitmore had not always been this silent figure in a hospital bed. He was once the kind of man people listened to the moment he entered a room. A mentor, a strategist, a father who built his life on strength and clarity. Before the stroke, he and Richard spoke almost every day, often about business, sometimes about life, rarely about anything emotional. Their bond was built on respect more than expression. And when that connection disappeared overnight, Richard didn't know how to replace it. So he did what he understood best. He tried to fix it. For nearly 2 years, Robert remained unresponsive. Machines tracked his vital signs. Nurses managed his care, and specialists monitored his condition. But the man who once shaped decisions and led conversations now existed in a state that felt suspended, unreachable. To the outside world, it looked like a life being maintained. To Richard, it felt like something unfinished, something he couldn't solve. And then there was Elena Ruiz. She arrived at the Whitmore estate with no formal credentials, no connections, and no expectations beyond keeping her job. She grew up in a small apartment in Newark, the daughter of a single mother who worked long shifts just to keep the lights on. From a young age, Elena was drawn to science, especially the way the human body worked. She borrowed books she couldn't afford, watched lectures she barely had the internet access to stream, and spent nights trying to understand concepts most people only encountered in classrooms she never had the chance to enter. College wasn't an option. Life moved faster than opportunity. Bills came first, responsibilities followed, and the idea of becoming a neurologist slowly shifted from a plan to a quiet ambition she carried without telling anyone. But she never stopped learning. Even after long days of work, she would sit in her room with worn-out textbooks, replaying online lectures, taking notes, and trying to connect theory to reality. By the time she stepped into the Whitmore estate, Elena wasn't just seeing a patient in a bed. She was observing patterns. Every sound in the room, every shift in breathing, every slight movement that others dismissed as involuntary. She paid attention in a way that didn't come from obligation, but from curiosity and determination. While the professionals relied on scheduled evaluations and formal tests, Elena noticed what happened in between. Elena wasn't just cleaning the house. She was studying it. Every hallway, every routine, every moment when the room was quiet enough to hear something others might miss. And most of all, she was watching Robert Whitmore, not as a lost case, but as a system she believed could still respond under the right conditions. Because long before she ever walked through those doors, Elena had already made a decision. She would understand the brain, no matter how long it took, no matter how many barriers stood in her way. And in a place where everyone else had stopped looking for answers, she continued to search for them in silence. The night of the incident began like many others in the Whitmore estate, carefully planned, precisely executed, and attended by people who were used to being in control. A private gala filled the main hall, with investors, colleagues, and longtime associates moving through conversations that rarely strayed beyond markets, strategy, and influence. Soft classical music played in the background, the kind chosen not to distract, only to reinforce the atmosphere. For Richard Whitmore, the evening wasn't just social, it was strategic. Every handshake mattered, every conversation had purpose, and every detail reflected the image he had spent years building. Away from that main hall, down a quieter corridor, Robert Whitmore lay in a separate room, exactly as he had been for months. The decision to keep him there during events had been made early on. It allowed Richard to maintain a sense of normalcy, to separate the world he controlled from the reality he couldn't change. A private nurse had finished her routine checks earlier that evening, and everything had been documented the same way it always was. No change, no response, no sign of awareness. Elena moved through the house quietly, as she always did, keeping her presence unnoticed. She had been assigned to finish cleaning in the East Wing, a task that usually took less than an hour. But as she passed the room where Robert lay, something made her pause. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was a shift in rhythm, something subtle enough that most people wouldn't have registered it. She stood still for a moment, listening, watching, letting her attention settle on details others overlooked. When she stepped inside, the room felt unchanged at first. The monitors displayed steady readings. The air carried the same quiet stillness, and Robert lay exactly where he had been placed earlier that evening. But then she noticed it. A slight variation in his breathing, not irregular, but different. His chest rose and fell with a faint hesitation, as if something internal was trying to synchronize with something external. Then, just as quickly, she saw a flicker near his eyes. Not a full movement, not something anyone would confidently call intentional, but enough to interrupt the pattern she had grown used to observing. It was small, almost invisible, but to Elena, it meant everything. Because in all the time she had spent watching, she had never seen that exact combination of responses before. Not together, not in that sequence. It wasn't proof, not in the way someone like Richard would demand, but it was a signal. And for Elena, a signal was enough to act on. She knew the risk immediately. This wasn't her role. She wasn't trained, she wasn't authorized, and she certainly wasn't expected to interfere with the care of a patient whose condition had already been defined by experts. If anyone saw her, there would be consequences. At best, she would lose her job. At worst, she could be held responsible for interfering with medical care. But standing there, watching that subtle shift repeat itself, she made a decision that had nothing to do with permission. Elena stepped closer and gently placed her hand against the edge of the bed, not touching Robert, but close enough to observe any reaction. Then she began with something simple. A soft, steady rhythm, tapped lightly against the wooden frame. Not loud enough to disturb the house, but consistent enough to create a pattern. She waited, watched, counted the intervals between each breath, each pause, each micro-movement. After a few seconds, she adjusted the rhythm slightly, matching it to what she believed his breathing was trying to follow. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, based on everything she had studied about neural response and sensory stimulation. Then, almost instinctively, she added movement. Slow at first, controlled. Not a performance, not for anyone to see, but as an extension of the rhythm itself. Her steps aligned with the tapping, her body creating a visual pattern to accompany the sound. There was a reason for it. Elena understood that the brain often responded to rhythm in ways that bypassed traditional pathways. Music, movement, repetition, these could activate areas that remained inaccessible through direct stimulation. She had read about it, studied it in fragments, seen examples in cases far removed from anything like this. But she had never tested it herself. Not like this. For a moment, nothing changed. The room held its silence. The monitors continued their steady display, and Robert remained still. Then, gradually, something shifted. It began with his hand. A slight twitch, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. Elena stopped for half a second, just long enough to confirm it wasn't coincidence. Then she continued, keeping the rhythm steady, her focus entirely on him. The movement came again, this time clearer. His finger tightened, then relaxed, as if responding to something beyond conscious control. Elena's breathing slowed as she adjusted her pace, careful not to break whatever connection had begun to form. And then she saw it. A single tear forming at the corner of his eye, tracing a slow path down his temple. The room fell into a kind of silence that felt heavier than before. Not empty, but suspended, as if something had shifted beyond what could be explained in that moment. Elena didn't stop. She couldn't, because what she was seeing wasn't supposed to happen. Not according to the reports, not according to the specialists, not according to anything she had been told to accept as final. And that's when everything changed. Richard Whitmore wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that part of the house at that moment. The gala was still in full swing, conversations unfolding exactly as planned, but something had already pulled his attention away. A brief update from staff, a subtle disruption in routine, nothing clearly defined, but enough for a man like Richard to notice. He moved through the corridor with purpose, each step measured, already expecting to correct whatever had gone off course. When he reached the door and looked inside, what he saw didn't fit any explanation he would have accepted. Elena stood near the bed, moving in a slow, controlled rhythm, her focus entirely on Robert Whitmore. For a second, Richard didn't speak. Not because he didn't understand what he was seeing, but because it made no sense within the rules he operated by. Then the reaction came, immediate and sharp. "What are you doing?" His voice cut through the room, breaking the pattern Elena had created. To him, it wasn't just inappropriate, it was unacceptable. This was his father, a patient under strict medical supervision, and she was acting without authority, without permission, without any recognized qualification. Elena stopped, but she didn't step away. She tried to explain, choosing her words carefully, aware of exactly who she was speaking to. She told him what she had observed, the changes in breathing, the slight eye movement, the pattern that didn't match what she had seen before. Then she explained her reasoning, as clearly as she could. The brain, she said, can respond to rhythm even when other pathways are damaged. Emotional memory, she added, doesn't always follow the same rules as physical response. Sometimes, familiar patterns, sound, movement, can reach parts of the brain that standard stimulation cannot. Richard listened, but his expression didn't change. To him, this wasn't a theory worth considering. It was speculation from someone outside her role. He had spent 2 years working with top specialists, reviewing data that had been tested, verified, and agreed upon. What Elena was describing didn't come with documentation, clinical trials, or measurable proof. It sounded, to him, like something he had learned to dismiss long ago. He shook his head slightly, his tone controlled but firm, making it clear he didn't accept what she was saying. And then, before either of them could say anything else, it happened again. Robert Whitmore's hand moved. This time there was no ambiguity, no question of whether it had occurred. His fingers tightened, then released, a clear, observable motion that interrupted the certainty Richard had built around his father's condition. The room shifted again, but now Richard was watching directly, not through a description, not through a report, but in real time. Elena didn't speak. She resumed the rhythm slowly, careful not to rush, allowing the pattern to rebuild itself. Richard remained where he was, his attention fixed on the smallest details. When the movement repeated, slightly stronger than before, he stepped closer without realizing it. His focus narrowed, the way it always did when something didn't align with his expectations. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He was analyzing. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house had gone quiet, Richard sat alone reviewing the security footage. He watched the moment Elena entered the room, observed her movements, tracked the timing of each response. Then he pulled up earlier recordings, comparing them side by side, looking for anything that resembled what he had just witnessed. He adjusted playback speeds, paused at key frames, and replayed sequences repeatedly, searching for consistency. What he found didn't match anything from the past 2 years. The reactions, however small, were different. They occurred in relation to specific stimuli, not randomly, not without pattern. The timing aligned. The responses, though limited, followed the rhythm Elena had introduced. For the first time since his father's stroke, Richard wasn't looking at a static condition. He was looking at change. For the first time in 2 years, there was something measurable. By the next morning, Richard Whitmore had already reviewed the footage more times than he could count, but repetition didn't weaken what he had seen. If anything, it made the pattern harder to ignore. He called Elena into the room, not with the urgency of anger, but with the controlled focus he reserved for things he couldn't immediately explain. This time, he didn't interrupt her. He asked her to walk him through exactly what she had done, step by step, without assumptions, without exaggeration, just the reasoning behind her actions. Elena didn't hesitate, but she didn't overstate anything either. She explained that she wasn't guessing, and she wasn't trying something random. She had been observing Robert for weeks, noticing subtle inconsistencies that didn't match the idea of complete unresponsiveness. She kept her explanation simple, not because the idea was simple, but because she knew complexity wouldn't convince him. She told him that the brain doesn't always shut down in a single way. Some parts can remain active even when others don't respond, and those parts are often connected to memory, emotion, and rhythm. She explained that music, or even simple rhythm, can activate areas of the brain tied to memory in ways direct stimulation cannot. Movement, she added, gives the brain something to follow, something predictable that it can attempt to match. And emotional familiarity, even when someone cannot speak or move, can still exist beneath the surface. It isn't always visible, but it can be triggered under the right conditions. What she had done wasn't a solution. It was an attempt to reach something that hadn't been reached yet. Richard didn't respond immediately. He stood beside the bed, looking at his father, processing what he was hearing against everything he had been told over the past 2 years. Then, without saying anything, he gave Elena a small nod, signaling her to continue. She stepped into position again, slower this time, aware that every movement was being watched, not just for what it was, but for what it might prove. She began with the same steady rhythm, soft and controlled, allowing the pattern to build naturally. The room remained quiet, but the tension had changed. This wasn't an experiment being dismissed. It was one being observed. Seconds passed, then a minute, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. Richard's expression tightened slightly, the part of him that relied on consistency, expecting the outcome to fail under scrutiny. Then it happened. Robert Whitmore's hand moved again, not just a twitch this time, but a deliberate tightening, his fingers closing around the edge of the sheet. Elena held her position, maintaining the rhythm without interruption. And then, slowly, almost carefully, Robert's hand shifted again, this time reaching just enough to make contact with Richard's. The contact was brief, but it was clear, a response that couldn't be dismissed as random. Richard froze, his attention narrowing to that single point of connection. He didn't move his hand away. He didn't speak. He simply waited, as if any sudden action might break whatever had just occurred. And then he saw it. A tear forming again at the corner of his father's eye, this time unmistakable, this time undeniable. Richard's reaction wasn't immediate. It didn't come as shock or disbelief. It came as realization, not just of what he was seeing, but of what he had overlooked. For 2 years, he had approached his father's condition the only way he knew how, through systems, through expertise, through resources that most people could never access. He had done everything right, at least by the standards he trusted. But standing there, watching a response triggered not by machines or procedures, but by something as simple as rhythm and presence, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. It wasn't the movement that affected him most. It was what it represented, that his father hadn't been entirely unreachable, that somewhere beneath everything the reports had defined, there was still a connection waiting for the right way to be reached. And that connection hadn't come from the solutions he had invested in. It had come from someone he had almost dismissed, someone he hadn't considered part of the equation. Richard lowered his head slightly, his composure breaking just enough to reveal what he had been holding back. Not because of what he saw in that moment, but because of what he finally understood. That control, no matter how precise, has limits. And that in trying to solve everything through certainty, he had overlooked something far more human. In the weeks that followed, progress came in small, measurable steps, the kind Richard Whitmore had always trusted, but this time driven by something he hadn't fully understood before. Robert Whitmore didn't suddenly recover, and nothing about his condition could be described as dramatic or complete, but there were changes that couldn't be dismissed. His responses became more consistent, his hand movements less isolated, his eyes tracking familiar patterns with growing clarity. It wasn't a reversal of everything that had happened, but it was movement, and after 2 years of stillness, that alone changed the way Richard saw the situation. The routines inside the house shifted quietly. Where once the focus had been entirely on maintenance, it now included interaction, repetition, and careful observation of what triggered response. Elena remained at the center of that change, not because she claimed authority, but because her approach had produced something no one else had been able to achieve. Specialists were consulted again, this time with new data, new footage, and new questions. And while none of them offered immediate explanations, none of them dismissed what was happening either. Richard didn't make his next decision lightly. For someone who built his life on certainty, this required something different. It required trust in something that couldn't yet be fully defined. But the evidence was in front of him, and for the first time, he allowed that to be enough. He offered Elena a position that extended far beyond her original role, not as staff, but as his father's primary caregiver, someone whose presence had already proven to matter in ways no one had expected. Along with that decision came something even more significant. Richard arranged for Elena to receive a full scholarship to study neuroscience, covering tuition, materials, and everything she would need to pursue the education she had been building toward on her own for years. It wasn't presented as charity, and it wasn't framed as a reward. It was an investment in something he now recognized as real potential, something that had already demonstrated value when it mattered most. The woman who wasn't supposed to be in that room became the one person they couldn't move forward without. And in a house where roles had always been clearly defined, that shift changed more than just responsibility. It changed perspective. Months later, Elena's life looked different, but not disconnected from where it began. She attended classes during the day, absorbing the formal education she had once only accessed in fragments, and returned to the Whitmore estate in the evenings, continuing the work that had started everything. The balance wasn't easy, but it was purposeful, and each time she stepped back into that room, she wasn't just applying what she had learned, she was building on something that had already proven possible. Robert Whitmore's condition remained complex, but the moments of response grew more frequent, more defined. A slight turn of the head, a steadier grip, a longer focus of the eyes. And on one occasion, brief but unmistakable, a small shift in expression that resembled something close to a smile. It didn't last long, but it was enough to confirm what Richard no longer questioned. Because sometimes the greatest breakthroughs don't come from the most expensive solutions or the most advanced systems. They come from attention, persistence, and the willingness to see what others overlook. And in this case, they came from someone who was never expected to be part of the answer, but became the reason progress was possible at all. Do you think the human brain is more powerful than we understand, or was this something science simply hasn't explained yet? And if you were in Richard Whitmore's position, after 2 years of certainty built on expert opinions and hard data, would you have trusted Elena Ruiz when everything she said challenged what you believed to be true? Would you have taken that risk, or would you have dismissed it the same way he almost did? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to hear how you would have handled that moment, especially when the cost of being wrong could mean losing the only progress you had left. And if this story surprised you, if it made you question how much we really understand about recovery, memory, and human connection, then there's another story you need to hear next.